The morning sun cast long shadows across Heathrow Airport's departure lounge as Sergeant Major William Harrison adjusted his civilian jacket one final time. Despite being out of uniform, his military bearing was unmistakable. The straight shoulders, the measured gait, the watchful eyes that had protected royalty for over 15 years. Today marked the end of his most challenging assignment yet. A 3-month security detail in Dubai that had tested every skill he'd acquired during his distinguished career with the Royal Guard. William had served the crown with unwavering dedication since he was 22 years old. His record was spotless, decorated with commendations for bravery, discretion, and exceptional service. He had stood guard at Buckingham Palace during state visits, accompanied the royal family on countless overseas trips, and had even received a personal thank you letter from King Charles himself after preventing a security breach during a public engagement in Manchester. The letter, carefully folded in his wallet, remained one of his most treasured possessions. The Dubai assignment had been particularly grueling. Working alongside international security teams, William had helped coordinate protection for a high-profile diplomatic summit. The desert heat, the complex logistics, and the constant vigilance required had drained him physically and mentally. All he wanted now was to return home to his small cottage in Windsor, where his wife Sarah and their 10-year-old daughter Emma were waiting with a home-cooked meal and stories about Emma's school play. As he approached the check-in counter, William felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. Another mission completed successfully, another step in a career that had defined his adult life. The airline representative, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a practiced smile, took his ticket and passport with routine efficiency. William had been booked in business class, a small luxury that the Royal Protection Unit provided for their operatives returning from extended overseas assignments. The representative's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard, but then she paused. Her smile faltered slightly as she stared at her computer screen, her brow furrowing in concentration. William noticed the change immediately. Years of reading people's faces and body language had made him acutely aware of even the smallest shifts in demeanor. Something was wrong, though he couldn't yet determine what. After several minutes of typing and clicking, the young woman looked up with an apologetic expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her voice carried a tone of rehearsed regret as she delivered news that would set in motion a chain of events no one could have anticipated. The words she spoke would transform what should have been a routine flight home into something far more significant, testing not just William's patience and dignity, but ultimately revealing the true character of both institutions and individuals when faced with moments that define who they really are. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Harrison," the airline representative said, her voice carrying that particular tone customer service agents use when delivering unwelcome news. "There's been an issue with your booking. We've had to downgrade you to economy class due to an overbooking situation in business class. We have several VIP passengers who require those seats, and company policy states that we must accommodate our premium frequent flyers first." William felt his jaw tighten slightly, but his expression remained composed. Years of military discipline had taught him to control his reactions, even when facing unexpected challenges. He had dealt with far more serious situations than a flight downgrade, though the dismissive tone in the woman's voice rankled him more than he cared to admit. "I understand there can be complications," William replied evenly, "but this ticket was purchased months ago through official government channels. Surely there must be some accommodation that can be made." He kept his voice polite but firm, hoping to resolve the situation without creating a scene. The last thing he wanted was to draw unnecessary attention to himself or cause problems that might reflect poorly on his unit. The representative, whose name tag read Jessica, barely looked up from her computer screen as she continued typing. "I'm afraid not, sir. The passengers we've had to accommodate are diamond-level frequent flyers, and they take absolute priority. You'll be compensated with a voucher for future travel, of course, but for today's flight, economy is all we have available." What William didn't know was that the VIP passengers Jessica mentioned were actually a group of wealthy socialites returning from a luxury shopping trip to Milan. They had complained loudly about their original economy seats, name-dropping connections and threatening to switch airlines if their demands weren't met. The gate manager, eager to avoid negative publicity on social media, had instructed his staff to find business class seats for the group regardless of existing bookings. Behind William in the queue, other passengers began to shift restlessly as the delay stretched on. A businessman in an expensive suit checked his watch impatiently, while a young mother struggled to keep her toddler entertained. The departure board showed William's flight was already beginning boarding, and he knew that prolonging this discussion would only make the situation more difficult for everyone involved. Jessica finally handed him a new boarding pass with obvious impatience. Gate 47B, economy seat 32F, boarding begins in 20 minutes. Next, she called out, already looking past William to the next passenger in line. The dismissal was clear and final, delivered with the cold efficiency of someone who had performed this routine many times before. William took the boarding pass and stepped aside, feeling a mixture of frustration and disappointment. It wasn't just about the comfort of the seat. It was about the casual disregard, the assumption that he was someone whose inconvenience didn't matter. As he gathered his carry-on bag and began walking toward the departure gate, he had no idea that his original business class seats were now occupied by passengers whose only qualification was their ability to complain loudly enough to get their way. William made his way through the bustling terminal toward Gate 47B, his military-trained eye automatically scanning the crowds around him. Even off-duty, old habits died hard. He noticed the usual mix of travelers, business people speaking rapidly into phones, families juggling luggage and restless children, tourists clutching guidebooks and cameras. The familiar sounds of airport announcements echoed overhead in multiple languages. As he approached his gate, William could see the boarding process had already begun. The business class passengers were settling into their spacious seats through the priority boarding lane, while economy passengers formed a longer line at the regular boarding gate. He took his place in the queue, still processing the morning's events with the analytical mind that had served him well in the Royal Guard. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country and protecting its most important citizens, being treated as an inconvenience by an airline that prioritized profit over principle. He thought about the countless dignitaries, politicians, and yes, members of the royal family he had helped travel safely around the world. The protocols, the careful planning, the attention to every detail that ensured their comfort and security. Standing in line, William struck up a brief conversation with the passenger ahead of him, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Peterson, who was returning home after visiting his grandchildren in Dubai. Mr. Peterson noticed William's bearing immediately. Military? He asked with the knowing look of someone who had served himself. When William nodded, the older man's expression grew more respectful. Thank you for your service, son. Not enough people appreciate what you folks do. The conversation was interrupted when a commotion arose near the business class boarding area. William turned to see a group of passengers being escorted to their seats with obvious fanfare. The airline staff were practically bowing as they guided the group. 4 women in designer clothing, laughing loudly and taking selfies. These were clearly the VIP passengers who had displaced him from business class. William watched as Jessica, the same representative who had downgraded him, personally escorted the group to their seats. She was all smiles and eager assistance now, a stark contrast to the cold efficiency she had shown him earlier. The women were clearly enjoying their upgraded treatment, posting photos on social media and talking loudly about their connections that had made the upgrade possible. One of the women, a blonde in an expensive tracksuit, was particularly vocal about her satisfaction. I told them we wouldn't stand for economy seats, she announced to her companions. When you know the right people and aren't afraid to speak up, you get what you deserve. Her friends laughed and agreed, completely unaware that their deserved seats had come at the expense of someone who had actually earned them through legitimate booking and service to his country. Meanwhile, William finally reached the front of the economy boarding line. The gate agent, a different person from Jessica, scanned his boarding pass with professional efficiency. Seat 32F, sir, down the aisle to your right, near the back of the aircraft. William nodded his thanks and proceeded down the narrow aisle, passing the business class cabin where he could see the group of women already settling in with champagne and warm towels. As he found his cramped economy seat, between a chattering teenager and a businessman who immediately claimed both armrests, William reflected on the morning's events. He wasn't angry exactly. His years of service had taught him that fairness wasn't always guaranteed in life. But there was something deeply wrong about a system that rewarded loud complaints over quiet dignity, that prioritized perceived status over actual service. Little did he know that the morning's injustice was about to be noticed by someone with the power to address it properly. 8 minutes had passed since William settled uncomfortably into his economy seat when an unusual stir began rippling through the airport terminal. Gate agents were speaking in hushed, urgent tones into their headsets, and security personnel were moving with purpose through the corridors. The businessman next to William looked up from his laptop, sensing the change in atmosphere that experienced travelers learn to recognize. Near the boarding gate, Jessica was receiving what appeared to be an urgent phone call. Her face had gone pale and she kept glancing nervously toward the aircraft. Other airline staff members were gathering around her, their expressions shifting from confusion to something approaching panic. The routine efficiency of airport operations was being replaced by barely controlled chaos. What the airline staff were learning in real time was that an unscheduled VIP arrival was taking place. The kind of arrival that required immediate and complete attention from everyone involved. Phone calls were being made to supervisors, who were calling their supervisors, as word traveled up the chain of command about a situation that none of them had anticipated or prepared for. Meanwhile, the aircraft captain, James Morrison, was conducting his standard pre-flight checks when his radio crackled to life with an unusual message from air traffic control. The words he heard made him pause mid-sentence in his conversation with his co-pilot. This was the kind of communication that happened perhaps once or twice in a pilot's entire career, if at all. Captain Morrison immediately began reviewing protocols he hoped he would never need to use. Back in the terminal, a small convoy of black vehicles had quietly arrived at a service entrance typically reserved for airport operations. The vehicles moved with practiced precision, their occupants remaining invisible behind tinted windows. Security teams that had been positioned throughout the airport began to activate, creating subtle barriers and redirecting passenger flow with the smooth efficiency of a well-rehearsed operation. William, still seated in economy, was unaware of the growing activity around the airport. He was reading a book about military history, trying to make the best of an uncomfortable situation. The teenager next to him was absorbed in her phone, while the businessman continued typing away on his laptop. None of the economy passengers had any indication that their routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary. Jessica, however, was having the worst morning of her professional life. The phone call she had just received was from her district manager, who had received a call from the regional director, who had been contacted directly by the airline's executive offices. The message was simple and terrifying. A mistake had been made and it needed to be corrected immediately. The identity of the passenger who had been downgraded was not what anyone had assumed. The executive who delivered the message had been brief and to the point. Find Sergeant Major William Harrison immediately. He is not just any passenger. He is currently returning from a classified assignment, and his travel arrangements were made through official government channels at the highest level. The person who authorized his downgrade has approximately 5 minutes to figure out how to fix this situation before it becomes an international incident, as Jessica frantically began making calls and checking passenger manifests. The convoy of vehicles in the service area came to a stop. Security personnel emerged first, followed by officials in dark suits who moved with the quiet authority of people accustomed to handling sensitive situations. And then, stepping out of the lead vehicle with the composed dignity that had made him one of the most respected monarchs in British history, came a figure whose presence would transform everything that happened next. King Charles III had arrived at Heathrow Airport, and he was not pleased with what he had learned about the treatment of one of his most trusted and decorated guardsmen. King Charles moved through the airport's service corridors with the measured pace of someone who understood the weight of his presence. His security detail maintained a discreet perimeter, as airport officials scrambled to accommodate the unexpected royal visit. The king had been en route to a private engagement when his personal secretary informed him of the situation involving Sergeant Major Harrison. What he learned had prompted an immediate detour that would soon become the talk of the entire airline industry. The story of how the king learned about William's treatment was itself remarkable. Earlier that morning, a routine security briefing had included a mention of William's return flight from Dubai. When a follow-up call revealed that there had been complications with his travel arrangements, Further investigation uncovered the full details of the downgrade. The king's reaction had been swift and decisive. He would handle this matter personally. Meanwhile, Jessica was experiencing what could only be described as the most stressful 8 minutes of her career. Her phone seemed to ring continuously as various levels of management tried to understand how a decorated member of the Royal Guard had ended up in economy class while a group of demanding tourists enjoyed business class seats. Each conversation brought new revelations about the severity of the mistake that had been made. The airline's district manager, Mr. Richardson, had arrived at the gate looking like a man facing his worst nightmare. He pulled Jessica aside for a conversation that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. "That man you downgraded isn't just any passenger. He's Sergeant Major William Harrison, one of the most decorated members of the Royal Guard. He's returning from a classified security assignment, and his travel was arranged through channels that you should never have touched." Jessica felt her stomach drop as the full implications became clear. The regular passenger she had dismissed so casually was someone who had dedicated his life to protecting the very institution that employed the person now walking through the airport corridors toward their gate. The VIP passengers she had been so eager to accommodate were nothing more than wealthy tourists who had complained loudly enough to get their way. On board the aircraft, Captain Morrison was receiving increasingly urgent communications from air traffic control and his own operations center. The flight that should have departed 15 minutes ago was now indefinitely delayed, and he was being told to prepare for a special boarding situation that would require his complete cooperation and discretion. As a veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience, he had seen many unusual situations, but this one was rapidly becoming extraordinary. William, still seated in economy, was beginning to notice the delay. The teenager next to him was complaining about missing a connection, while the businessman was making increasingly agitated phone calls about his schedule. William checked his watch with the patience of someone accustomed to military operations, where delays were common and rarely came with explanations. In the business class cabin, the group of women who had displaced William were becoming increasingly vocal about the delay. They demanded to know why the flight wasn't departing on schedule, threatening to post negative reviews and contact their influential friends if the situation wasn't resolved immediately. Their voices carried throughout the cabin, creating an atmosphere of entitled impatience that stood in stark contrast to William's quiet dignity in economy class. What none of the passengers knew was that the aircraft was now under special security protocols. The air traffic control tower had cleared all other traffic from the immediate area, and ground crew were being briefed on procedures they had practiced but never used. Throughout the airport, a carefully orchestrated operation was taking place that would soon bring one of the most powerful people in the world face to face with a situation that perfectly illustrated the difference between earned respect and demanded privilege. As King Charles IX approached the departure gate, accompanied by his security detail and increasingly nervous airline officials, he carried with him not just the authority of the crown, but the personal conviction that those who serve their country deserve better than what Sergeant Major Harrison had received that morning. The arrival of King Charles at Gate 47B created an immediate transformation in the atmosphere. Airline staff who had been going about their routine duties suddenly found themselves in the presence of the monarch, and the effect was electric. Jessica, who minutes earlier had been dismissively efficient, now stood frozen with the realization that her actions were about to be scrutinized by the highest authority in the land. The king's approach was measured and dignified, but those who knew him well could detect the controlled displeasure in his bearing. As he reached the gate area, he was met by Mr. Richardson and the airport's senior management, all of whom had arrived in record time once word of the royal presence spread. The conversations that followed were brief, professional, and left no doubt about the king's expectations. "I understand there has been an issue with the travel arrangements of one of my guardsmen," the king said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had been refined over decades of public service. "Sergeant Major Harrison is returning from an assignment that required him to be away from his family for 3 months in service to this country. I would very much like to understand how such a dedicated individual came to be treated with such disregard." Mr. Richardson, perspiring despite the air conditioning, began to explain the situation while carefully avoiding any mention of the real reason for William's downgrade. His explanation about computer glitches and unavoidable overbooking was met with the kind of polite skepticism that only royalty can truly master. The king listened patiently, but his questions revealed that he already understood exactly what had happened. Meanwhile, word of the king's presence had begun to spread throughout the aircraft. Captain Morrison made a carefully worded announcement to the passengers about a special diplomatic situation that was causing the delay. But rumors were already flying through both business class and economy. The group of women in business class who had been so vocal about their importance just minutes earlier were now notably quiet as they began to realize that their morning of complaints might have attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention. In economy class, William noticed the unusual activity around the gate but remained focused on his book. Years of royal protection duty had taught him to recognize when security situations were developing, but he assumed this was unrelated to his flight. The businessman next to him was speculating loudly about what kind of VIP could cause such a commotion, while the teenager was taking photos of the increasing security presence. Outside the aircraft windows, the king's request to board the aircraft and speak with Sergeant Major Harrison personally sent shockwaves through the airline's chain of command. This was not a standard protocol, and nobody was quite sure how to handle a situation where the monarch wanted to personally address a service issue. After several frantic phone calls to corporate headquarters and legal departments, the decision was made to accommodate the royal request. As preparations were made for the king to board the aircraft, Jessica found herself face to face with the consequences of her morning's decisions. The district manager's earlier words echoed in her mind as she watched the careful coordination taking place around her. The regular passenger she had so casually dismissed was about to receive a personal apology from the King of England, while she contemplated the likely end of her career in customer service. The security detail that accompanied the king moved with practiced efficiency, ensuring that the aircraft was secure while maintaining the discretion that such situations required. Airport police created a subtle perimeter around the gate area, redirecting curious passengers and maintaining order without creating panic or drawing unnecessary attention to the developing situation. As the king prepared to board the aircraft, he carried with him not just the authority to correct this particular injustice, but the opportunity to demonstrate the values that the monarchy represented. In a world where customer service often favored the loudest complainers over the quietly deserving, he was about to show that true leadership recognized and honored genuine service to country and crown. The aircraft door opened, and King Charles stepped aboard to address a situation that would soon become a defining moment for everyone involved. As King Charles made his way down the aircraft aisle, every passenger fell silent. The businessman next to William stopped typing mid-sentence, while the teenager dropped her phone entirely. Even the chattering group in business class had gone completely quiet, suddenly aware that their morning of complaints and demands was about to be viewed through a very different lens. William looked up from his book to see a familiar figure approaching, someone he had protected and served for years, now walking toward him with obvious purpose. For a moment, the sergeant major was speechless. In all his years of royal service, he had never imagined a scenario like this. He immediately began to rise from his seat, but the king gestured for him to remain seated. "Sergeant Major Harrison," the king said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent cabin. "I understand you've had rather an unpleasant morning with your travel arrangements. I've come to personally ensure that this situation is addressed properly." The king's words were formal but warm, and everyone on the aircraft could hear the genuine respect in his tone. William found his voice, though it took a moment. "Your Majesty, this is completely unnecessary. It's just a flight upgrade issue, nothing that requires your personal attention." Even in his surprise, William's training showed through. He was more concerned about inconveniencing the king than about his own treatment. "On the contrary," the king replied, "it's entirely necessary. When someone who has served the crown with distinction for 15 years is treated with such disregard, while others who have done nothing more than complain loudly are rewarded, it reflects poorly on all of us." His words carried throughout the cabin, and their implications were not lost on anyone present. The king then turned to address Captain Morrison, who had emerged from the cockpit upon learning of the royal presence. Captain, I believe there's been a mistake with the seating arrangements. Sergeant Major Harrison should be in business class where his ticket originally placed him. I trust this can be corrected immediately." The question was polite, but carried the unmistakable weight of royal authority. Captain Morrison nodded immediately. "Of course, Your Majesty. We'll make the necessary adjustments right away." He then announced over the cabin intercom that passengers would need to verify their seating assignments, as there had been administrative errors that required correction. The scene that followed was remarkable in its quiet efficiency. The group of women who had demanded business class seats found themselves politely but firmly escorted back to economy class, their protests dying in their throats as they realized who was overseeing the correction. Jessica, who had boarded the aircraft with the management team, watched in mortified silence as her morning's decisions were systematically reversed. As William was escorted to his proper business class seat, the king walked alongside him. "I want you to know," the king said quietly, "that your service has not gone unnoticed. The assignment you've just completed in Dubai was particularly challenging, and your professionalism throughout has been exemplary. This morning's treatment was completely unacceptable, and I want to personally ensure it doesn't happen again." The conversation between the king and William continued for several minutes, covering not just the morning's events but William's family, his years of service, and his future assignments. Other passengers watched in amazement as they witnessed a genuine exchange between a monarch and one of his most dedicated servants. It was a masterclass in leadership, showing how true authority is exercised not through demands or complaints, but through recognition of genuine merit and service. Before departing the aircraft, the king made one final announcement to all the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have the privilege today of flying alongside Sergeant Major Harrison, one of the finest members of our Royal Guard. His service to this country over the past 15 years has been exemplary, and I wanted to personally ensure he receives the respect and treatment he has earned." The king's words were met with spontaneous applause from the passengers, who now understood they were in the presence of someone truly deserving of recognition. As the king departed the aircraft, the impact of his intervention was immediately apparent. William was settled comfortably in business class where he belonged, while the airline staff began the process of reviewing their policies to ensure such a situation could never happen again. The flight finally departed, but the story of what had happened would spread far beyond that aircraft, becoming a powerful reminder that true leadership means standing up for those who serve with honor, even when they're too modest to demand it for themselves. The lesson was clear. In a world where the loudest voices often get the most attention, sometimes it takes the intervention of someone with real authority to ensure that quiet dignity and genuine service receive the recognition they truly deserve.